Good morning, everyone. I have the privilege of introducing this extraordinary panel. I cannot possibly do justice to them in the short time that we have, so I really urge you to take a look at their bios that are included in your material. But let me just do a very quick run-through with respect to each of our panel members, and then I will turn it over to Tim Sparapani, who's seated here. And starting off with him, he is currently playing a couple of roles as Vice President of Law, Policy, and Government Relations with the ADA, or Application Developers Alliance, and also as a principal at SPQR Strategies, with experience in policy and privacy issues with Facebook and ACLU prior to that. Also with us is Jonathan Gordon, General Counsel and Senior Vice President of IAC Search, a division of IAC Interactive Corporation, overseeing global legal relations and operations for a large number of digital content businesses. Joanne McNabb is with us and is the Director of Privacy Education Policy, and this is really quite a title, in the Privacy Enforcement Protection Unit of the California Department of Justice. And she's busy protecting all of us in California under our privacy laws and under our California Constitution, as well as, of course, being concerned with federal, state, and other and local laws and regulations. Also on the panel is Seth Metch, a Vice President and Digital Media Counsel in the Legal and Business Affairs Division of A+E Networks, a major provider of television programming and operating digital properties on a variety of platforms. Andy Roth is with us, and Andy, as well as being on the board of our organization, CLIP, is a partner and chair of Denton's Global Privacy and Cybersecurity Group, which pretty much says it all. And previously was, as he may have mentioned earlier, you heard him mention, he was Chief Privacy Officer also of American Express. And Dr. Anna Slomovic, and I apologize, Anna, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, has extensive experience in privacy and ethical issues in the healthcare business, financial services, identity management, and government policy areas, including and particularly experience in the health and fitness wearables and apps. And I'm sure we're going to have a number of questions about those as well. But first, we're going to hear from our Kickstarter, and the whole idea behind the Kickstarter is he's going to give us a run-through of the critical issues that we're going to discuss on this panel, and then we'll have a free-flowing discussion. I hope not a free-for-all, but a free and flowing discussion about some of the things he's raised in his Kickstarter statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Patel, and to my distinguished colleagues up here on the panel, and to those of you in the audience, also to Fordham and CLIP, and Professor Reidenberg for the opportunity to kickstart this conversation about app privacy. When first asked to give some remarks about the state of app privacy, I was tempted to give one of those classic Washington statements that presidents give when they give the State of the Union, and they say, "The state of app privacy is strong, but more must be done." And then to sit down and let you all discuss with the admonition, discuss, and then be done with it. And then that would, of course, save you from having to listen to me. And even better, it would be able to save me from having to display to the entire audience that I'm essentially a contrarian and a heretic. And by saying a great number of things that are certain to please neither startups, nor regulators, nor academics. You see, I specialize in being unpopular. But anyway, it's Professor Reidenberg's fault for giving me the podium, a mistake I'm sure he is at this moment already regretting. So I will plunge ahead and give 7 points in under 10 minutes, I hope, that will spur the panelists coming after me to intense debate and discussion. So without further ado, the future is a data-driven world, powered by information consumers willingly exchange with companies that can help them take advantage of their data. Data is, of course, the lifeblood of IT-based innovation. It has improved our lives and our economy in a myriad of ways. Increased but wise use of data by savvy companies will unlock the value from data to grow our economy, identify the previously unknown causes of societal problems, and help people live happier, faster, and more productive lives. Threats to that future are stoked by well-intentioned but mistaken views about the risks of advanced analytics and increased data use. Fear-driven rhetoric may lead to policy choices that appear to protect consumers in the short run, but ultimately leave them exposed to unscrupulous buyers and sellers of data who misapply that data during key moments. I believe that a focus on ad regulation has prevented regulation of unscrupulous data brokers, for example. App developers and data-focused businesses understand these potential risks and recognize their future lies in partnership with consumers and addressing these particular risks. That's why the Application Developers Alliance, one of my clients, worked for 18 months to help build at-a-glance privacy screens through the Obama administration's multi-stakeholder process at the Department of Commerce. The result of that lengthy set of deliberations in public was free software given away to apps to replace outdated 10,000-word-long legal liability disclaimers called privacy policies. We welcome others embracing this simple approach that can dramatically advance transparency and consumer understanding. Point number 2, contrary to the negative perspective too often found in the press, the interests of consumers and app developers are aligned closely. Consumers should not have to choose between the benefits of technology and protection of their data. App developers and their technology partners can and should provide both. We should build a world where consumers get the tremendous upside of new services and tools brought about by the use of their data, and where we develop technological protections for consumers from data misuse. App developers want to introduce consumers to completely new technologies, powered by consumers' data, which offer extraordinary cost and time-saving benefits. In turn, consumers want technology to make life easier and cheaper. They want their content to be available on demand, wherever they are, and they know that the mobile app and Internet of Things revolutions are making this possible. App developers should be free to innovate using the data consumers freely share with them to create entirely new opportunities that consumers might love. Consumers, in turn, should be empowered by technologies to see those opportunities and decide whether they want them. Point number 3, consumers will benefit directly from rules that allow companies to use and share data more freely. I think this is in contrast to what the chairwoman was just saying. Limits on collection or subsequent reuse of data by companies stifle innovation and ultimately rob consumers of the value that can be unlocked from their own data. You see, I think we're leaving consumers with a false choice. We're not giving them enough for the data that they're giving us as an industry, and yet we're denying them their protections on the other end that would make them feel free to share their data. So when these limits are imposed, companies are forced to build one-size-fits-all tech that, as a rule, limits each individual's benefit from that technology. Consumers will benefit even more in the future from personalized and customized services that are made possible by increased data usage, sharing, and analytics. Customized services put controls in the hands of consumers when they're done well and increase the partnership between each customer and each app. This is not deregulation of data, but rather it's an opportunity to pick the right regulation, if any, to match emerging technologies. So we should recognize point 4, technology has changed dramatically. It is long past time, in my opinion, to reconsider whether decades-old principles designed to protect privacy are the best means of achieving consumers' goals. The FIPS were first written in the 1960s and first embodied in US government doctrine in 1974. 40 years ago, we stored documents in file cabinets, and computer processing speeds and storage capacities were just a tiny fraction of what they are now. Privacy thinkers at the time enunciated privacy guidance in an era before we understood that consumers' data could be used for their benefit. So collection limits and retention limits were designed to protect consumers from government surveillance, something I know a great deal about, but were adapted over time by privacy advocates as principles to control corporate data use. Isn't it time, I ask, to ask anew whether these principles still give corporations useful guidance about how to best protect consumers from data risks, or whether other alternatives might be more successful in an emerging era of cyber threats. Efforts to protect privacy are currently misdirected because they are focused on resolving hypothetical or theoretical risks, instead of identifying and really working on this as a group to solve the few but really important known privacy risks of data usage. We have been distracted about potential and attenuated problems that might occur due to data. Data-powered companies know what can really harm consumers. Use of erroneous data or misuse and abuse of accurate data to make decisions about consumers in key moments of their life. That's when real harm occurs, and we should do everything in our power as an industry to stamp it out. The good news is that I think we can anticipate the discrete problems that may arise from increased corporate use of consumers' data and implement targeted solutions to those narrow problems before they begin. In addition to narrow focused regulatory and legislative interventions, data-driven businesses can and should build redress mechanisms. Yes, you heard me right. I'm saying corporations should do real redress. We need to make consumers whole when we make mistakes with their data. Consumers should not have to wait forever. I don't want to wait for forever for omnibus consumer privacy laws that will never be enacted to be able to protect me and empower me to share my data with companies to get the products and services I love. I don't think you should have to wait either. That's why corporations have to step up. So I propose instead a type of corporate consumer due process to provide real redress to by every business that wants to use consumers' data in new and novel ways. So as we get to the end of this, consumers love their apps. They love what they provide. And regulators, I think, need to especially acknowledge this. And then we need to respect consumers' choices to choose these technologies that consumers are embracing. We need to trust consumers in the digital age. We're 30 years past the augment of the internet age, and we ought to recognize that most of the populace is quite well aware of what their choices are, I think. More importantly, for consumers, we should make it easy as businesses for them to turn on and off this data sharing. It shouldn't be a binary choice, always on or always off. If we're going to personalize and customize services, and we as businesses want to be able to provide those great business opportunities, we should also turn to our consumers as partners and say, when you want to turn this off, you can, and you can do it easily. I think we need to build the technology to do that. I think it's actually quite easily achieved. Moreover, I think we need to thoughtfully redesign our regulatory system to embrace this promise of data and maximize each person's individual and society's collective benefit. Last 2 points. I think regulators around the world should seek to harmonize rules to increase data usage while ensuring consumers retain control about data. Innovative companies can sprout everywhere, including Colombia and Bulgaria, 2 places with thriving tech startup scenes. I'm glad that our friends are here from both of those nations and from Argentina as well, because we really do have the opportunity to see great businesses being built everywhere. But the country you reside in should not, in my opinion, dictate whether you get to use your data for your own benefit. Moreover, app developers want universal rules. They know the marketplace is a global one, and they want to be able to provide one set of systems for the entire world population. So lastly, app developers have to be wise stewards of data, of the data entrusted to them by consumers. If consumers want more, not less benefits to be returned to them from data, it should be our responsibility as an industry to help them rebalance the marketplace so that they can reap those benefits to the fullest. And more importantly, we should do exactly what consumers want on security. And this is my final point. I think the FTC has got it exactly right. We should plunge ahead and push encryption and similar technologies wherever possible. Consumers understand the risks that they face in the wake of daily stories about data breaches and cyber attacks. We should push back against the FBI, the NSA, and other state and local law enforcement agencies that want backdoors to encryption. This is the safest, cheapest, easiest means of protecting consumers and bringing them fully into this data revolution. So thank you for the opportunity to provoke each of you this morning. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with my colleagues on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to call on one of the panel members, who's been writing furiously over here, to see what she has to say about all of that. But by the way, I'm going to use first names, and please, my first name is Marilyn, and cut out the judge stuff and all that. And Joanne, we've not had the privilege of meeting, but let me ask you a first question, following up on something he said early on. do consumers willingly exchange or provide their information? And then take it from there to wherever
Yeah.
you want to take it.
He is provoking. Sometimes, and not always. I think, as Chairman Ramirez said, the black box into which our data goes and what happens in there and where it goes after we enter it in some place is indeed not understood by many people. So let me see. Among the many interesting points, I think I very much agree with his point about harmonizing privacy rules around the world. Harmonizing, which does not mean making identical. It does not, harmony, means they go well together, but it's not unison in the musical sense. Different cultures have different, differently calibrated values, and privacy is very definitely a value that has to be calibrated by the culture of the people whose data is involved. I think the issue of whether consumers understand what's happening to their data and whether consumer and app developer interests are always aligned might be examined in light of, say, the history of Girls Around Me, which was, are you familiar with Girls Around Me? An app that allowed someone, that used location information and Foursquare, and allowed someone to, who had the app, to find girls, women in physical proximity with their showing up on a map, their information having been drawn from Facebook and when they had signed into Foursquare. So here's this list of girls that I can see pictures of, and then I can get onto their Facebook pages and find out a lot about them. The information that was in that was provided in Girls Around Me, was drawn from information that the women had voluntarily posted publicly on Facebook. They had voluntarily logged on to Foursquare. So they were making that information available, right? And yet, did they, I say no, based on the reaction, understand they would end up showing up on a map like a Target in a totally other app? No, and that didn't work out too well. And it's the unexpected, unpleasant surprise of many data practices that I think calls into question the idea that the developer and the consumer, the user, the individual person have the same interests.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll take a stab.
Good.
Is it that people don't know or they don't care? Or is it a little bit of both? I mean, everyone that has Gmail knows that Google's reading through your emails. Still, it's the most popular email service, free email service, when there are plenty of alternatives. DuckDuckGo has gotten pretty much no traction at all in search. It's a private search engine. I don't know if people don't know. I think people are starting not to care. But maybe the answer is people don't care because they don't really know because people really don't know what companies are doing with their information. Just trying to get into the mindset of the user. Any thoughts on that?
That's the same thing as, and we've just recently gone through, as we've done more with our networks and our apps and our web properties, in terms of being able to do tracking people and serve them specified ads and all that. And so we've done a lot of work on our privacy policy to try and make it as clear as possible and as prominent as possible, and let people know exactly what we're able to do. But I'm sure if I ran analytics on the privacy policy page, people aren't reading it anyway. It's more likely to be the people in this room that read it than any consumer who's watching a TV show on one of our sites or apps. So I think that people like to sort of act surprised a lot, but they don't think about it before they engage in anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all in favor of free choice, as you put it, Tim, but I don't know what our obligations are to provide enough information that people can make informed decisions. I think I speak as someone who runs 6 or 7 popular apps. I'm not sure we're doing that great of a job right now explaining to users what we're doing with their information.
Well,
But then
who
again,
has that
I don't know.
responsibility? Who has that responsibility? And can you call it free choice if it's uninformed choice?
What makes it uninformed? Because I think everyone universally knows if you scroll to the bottom of the webpage, you can see where the privacy policy is. How many people go look and read it? It's not like it's hidden, it's not in a non-standard place. It's pretty standard at this point.
Well, and that's why there's been this emphasis, both by the FTC and many players, including the NTIA, and on having a short form, more timely notice of just the sort of unexpected practices with data that are not related to what's obvious. Like you go onto Yelp, you know it's going to use your location. That's its purpose, but you wouldn't expect it to download your whole contact list, for example. I'm not saying they do. I have no idea. I want to make a case for the comprehensive, often mostly unread privacy policy as actually benefiting consumers, in spite of the fact that they don't read it. It promotes governance and accountability. It forces the fact that is required by, among other things, California law. It forces an organization to become aware of its data practices and to some degree, express them and then therefore stand behind them. It's not a good communication piece to the consumer, but it's a good governance piece.
And I'll agree with you. I think to those of you that haven't gone through this process ever or recently, it's not as simple as drafting a privacy policy. I mean, it was a months and months long process. As I'm doing this new one, working with outside counsel, who actually Andy's my outside counsel, so it's good to be able to turn that way. But is working, but then going through groups, and as a mid-sized company, we have lots of groups that do lots of different things. So I have different TV networks, and making sure I meet with the people who run the properties for each, making sure this is what we're doing, this is what we follow. There's marketing teams. There are a lot of moving pieces, and there are things that someone may hire an agency to do, and we have less insight in making sure that all of our contracts make our vendors comply with these practices, making sure everyone's aware when there's personnel changeover. It's a lot of work, if you're conscientious about it, to make sure that you're actually following your policies.
I bet you found out some things you might have changed.
Or then you learn about some web property that you didn't know we even had. And you say, where is the footer with even my link to the privacy policy there? Oh, well, so-and-so in marketing did this with some vendor. Now, all of a sudden, I've got to, by working on this, I set up a new procedure where anytime, and I sort of started it almost at, when we're registering a domain, these are now the steps that you have to go through to make sure that at that sort of initial choke point, you hit these right people and we do the right things, because otherwise someone could do like a marketing stunt, as they like to call it, and no one even knows about it internally because it's supposed to look viral, so.
I'd like to point out that Carnegie Mellon recently did an interesting study where they actually, where they actually notified people about how many times their location was accessed by various apps. And people were shocked to find out, for example, that Groupon accessed their location information like every 10 minutes, even when they were asleep. So it's not just an unexpected practice as such that in a privacy policy it would say, we access your location information to offer you better coupons for where you are. It's the way it's done. And I have never seen a privacy policy that actually explains how something works. It's very much general, in part because you don't want to keep changing it and you don't want to keep sending people copies that say, oh, sorry, we have now changed vendors and we're no longer using this one instead of that one. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that companies don't actually explain how stuff works. And I would dispute that consumers actually understand how their data is sent, where their data is sent, and how it's used, where it's received.
So I wanted to jump in for a second, and I find it very interesting, Tim, that that the Valley and counterparts around the world make this argument that they're against mass collection by the government as a surveillance tool, but on the collection use distinction for commercial purposes, they're in favor of collection and then put the restrictions on use. I actually think that there's a missing component from the discussion, which is technology and innovation. And so I think, unfortunately, people do really care. I'm of the opinion that social has sort of matured. It's had this meteoric rise, and that the next biggest social network is an antisocial network. And that you're seeing companies look to a different level of personalized engagement with individuals. And McDonald's never sold salads until it was profitable to sell salads. And so DuckDuckGo was sort of a first run at privacy technology, encryption. These things have been very kludgy. They haven't really had the same user experience as the breakaway popular apps. But I think there's something to be said for policy can only go so far. And actually, I think the market will start to shift, and you'll see a lot of innovation around privacy and security and finding ways to engage with the connected world without disclosing your identity.
I have a question. I can play the role that I can righteously play, and that is of an uninformed consumer. And what happens with that data when it is, whatever data is being collected by the first end user, so to speak, and how does that collector determine what to do with that data? Like, who is it going to sell it to, if it is going to sell it, or where it's going to move to, and so forth? I'd like to know, what is that whole stream of, quote, commerce, or whatever it is, that gets that data to data brokers, for example, or other parties who then do something with the data? Can somebody answer that for me? I guess probably all of you can.
Well, I can say something. First of all, a lot of times it's not a first party. A lot of times data will simultaneously go to multiple parties. Especially in apps and wearable devices, very often the data will go at the same time to several different houses. It'll go to an analytics house that will provide the data to the developer. It'll go to the developer. It'll go potentially to marketers or advertisers. It'll go to social networks if the app is connected to a social network. So somebody's name is on the app, and we generally tend to think of them as a first party, but they're not the only ones who are receiving data to begin with.
But who just makes the decision who else is going to receive it?
Okay, so generally it'll be that person whose name is on the app, but they may not always determine every single third party. So for example, the way web pages work is they collect data from various places. They don't just come from one source. So the first party may hire somebody, for example, to run an advertising bidding platform. And depending on how that platform determines whose ad should be served, it'll be data going to and coming from a different set of parties for different ads or for different parts of the web page. At least in theory, the app developer should be the one who decides and says, yes, we're going to use marketing, yes, we're going to use social, and then work with those modules to define what is permissible and what is not. But I don't know that given the current state of app development, where you literally can pull blocks, pre-built blocks, and combine them into an app. You can pull a shopping cart pre-built code, you can put catalog pre-built code, you can put social pre-built code. I'm not sure that all app developers actually look through all of these blocks to determine where they will be sending the data. It's just fairly easy and convenient to put out an app that's put together in a very clever way from multiple blocks, and it's not clear to me that these folks even think that it matters. It's not that they're being malicious, it's just that it's not how they think.
It's interesting that because I do a lot of agreements for app development and digital property development, and I'm very specific about this stuff contractually. But I only know what I know. I'm not examining code, and I aim for full disclosure. And we do run things through certain tools, but I probably know less about apps that we build in-house and our in-house developers do that there is no contract for. It's one of those weird things is I think I'm better protected when we hire someone to do it. But what's interesting, I'd say, at least on the ad side, is we have specific guidelines, and we allow people to opt out of online behavioral advertising, and we use the IAB's version 3 standard terms that govern data. But when we get the actual ad in, we run that ad through a tool or through several tools to make sure that it's not collecting stuff. And people give you stuff all the time, and we have to reject ads all the time because no, you can't do this. You can't be placing that cookie. You can't be dropping that cookie or doing this. And again, it's a thing. You got to be just very conscientious on all these things and examining things if you want to follow your own policies.
There's
And how much of this is communicated to the user?
Well, the online behavioral advertising, I think, is actually, the privacy policy is a really long thing because it covers a lot. I think the about ads is a great thing because it's pretty short. It's a separate, like, at least for us on our footer, it's a separate thing. And you click, it's 1 or 2 paragraphs, and it clicks you to a link where you can, do the opt-out right away. So I think it's communicated better where it's something short and discreet like that. It's hard to communicate everything in the big picture otherwise.
I think one of the challenges is a fundamental lack of technology subject matter expertise with policymakers, with consumers, because the shift that's taken place is you don't really have a linear, as you said, you don't have a linear data flow. Like this person had the data and then they pass it. It's not a bucket brigade. It's really with these pipes, these APIs that exist and libraries and third-party development platforms. And so it does get very complicated. I think there are a lot of challenges, not just because of what data is being passed immediately, but because the ability to use Hadoop and unstructured data and big data to sift through huge amounts of data and drive meaningful outcomes and re-identify people. But again, I think the answer is probably not, Tim, creating, unless we're finally gonna have that omnibus privacy law in the US, which I don't think we're gonna get, the answer is probably innovation. And so I'm sort of there with you on a lot of stuff. I just think that, the echo chamber, sometimes people talk to themselves about how they're different than the government, but there are sometimes striking parallels.
The motivations are different, and I think when the government's motivations can be frightening in a way that companies' motivations aren't, but I think that's.
The government can lock you up.
But I would come at this from a little bit different angle. With our apps, we struggle with monetization. And, that's the word that we spend the most time thinking about, the concept we spend the most time thinking about. You start with users, you're selling a $1.99 app. That doesn't really pay the bills. You have to find ways to monetize your app. And that means, for most apps, advertising. And between the user and the user's data, which is what you need to make ads that people click on, and the advertiser, there's a whole infrastructure of companies and ad placement companies, and the user's data is going to be filtered through those companies and through those sources. It's a lot of hands are going to touch it. And most privacy policies, when you're starting an app, are going to allow that. And it'll say something like, we can share your information with our affiliates, or something like that. And that gives the app company more or less license to share your user data. What user data is it? Location, search history, interests, email, your Amazon receipts. the kinds of stuff that you like and you use on the internet. And that's shared with various companies for the purpose of targeting better ads.
I think there's two other things that make this conversation really quite complex and hard to answer your question. In the sense that I think of the app developer industry as three different industries built into one. There are people like the gentleman next to me who build apps on their own natively and then offer those products and services directly to consumers under the name of the app that they built. There are developers for hire. You literally want an app built, you go and find a developer, the team will build it for you, they hand it back to you, they may manage some of it, but it's essentially built for you on a contract for hire basis. And then there's companies like those represented, A&E's I think are probably a pretty good example, where they may build some of it, the app in-house, or they may contract for some of it externally, but it's being done under a brand, and the brand is moving from other more typical areas of business, either online through the web or sort of a bricks and mortar store, and is now offering the app as a third storefront or third means of communicating with consumers. So we've got at least three different types of industries within the app industry. And so developing a rule set for those three industries can be complex. The other thing I would say that is really challenging is that size and scale matter a lot here. And every choice that we make in the future about privacy rules or data innovation rules that we would impose that make distinctions between first and third parties have profound implications for whether new entrants can join the market. So if you're a large, enormous, vertically or horizontally integrated company, you're going to have a lot of the capabilities internally to do many of these things, right? You're going to have your own ad targeting system, perhaps. Maybe you'll have your own marketing scheme. Maybe you'll have your own payment system. You might have a whole bunch of the components of what goes into building an app. If you're a small individual app and you're just getting started, you're probably going to outsource some or all of those functions to third parties, whether it be ad serving or mobile payments processing or back-end storage and service. So it's a really complex ecosystem that we're working with now.
Yeah, it's like building apps are like building Legos, even for a large public company like us. We outsource our payment and other services on our apps.
Well,
It's going
there are-
to continue.
So I just wanted
lot of those
to
companies
jump
will
in
be
and say that
Yes, please.
IAC is very interesting, and I on the side have co-founded a company with a kid who was in Hatch Labs and worked on Tinder. And so Tinder is a great example where advertising has been driving this issue, right? I mean, that's what we're really talking about, is that advertising is probably the oil in the system rather than data.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Tinder actually has been doing great because they found a different monetization strategy, which was to charge a premium. And so I think that as markets mature, as technology moves out of this sort of primitive level that we're in now, companies will look to deepen the engagement with users, and privacy, I believe, will become I'm still probably alone on this, will become a competitive advantage. But it's interesting, you're seeing already that some of the successes in monetization and taking core assets and maturing them and developing and scaling them is not necessarily about advertising. Sometimes about building your own platform and deepening the engagement with your users.
Yeah, we've been very experimental in our monetization. Tinder is an example of that. We offer premium services and premium subscriptions. We charge people at certain levels for higher than others. Vimeo is also one of our companies that we charge for people to upload videos to the system. I mean, you can certainly experience different kinds of monetization, but still, though, there's nothing beats ad monetization, especially for startups. And I'm going to say one other thing that nothing beats, can I say this word? I don't know. In this audience, nothing beats Google monetization. And the reason that no one can beat Google monetization is because Google has such access to user information that they target ads better than anyone. And it's a multiple difference from their nearest competitor. And that's all about their ability to collect and analyze user information. And I think part of this conversation has to be constraints on Google. And then when you start to talk about regulators, I mean, you have to ask how regulators can effectively regulate a Google, given their political power. So I wonder if maybe the best place for privacy, safety, for protection for consumers is actually in the courts, in the common law system. It's worked for hundreds of years.
So I mean, it's always going to be, right, hard for legislation to keep up, because the technology will always innovate faster than the legislative process. So
Well, this has been true across the board with all kinds of, whether you talk about patent law or you talk about copyrights or whatever, all of the laws just are way behind by generations. But speaking about something that the chair of the FTC talked about, and that is who has the responsibility in all of this for minimization?
There's,
If there is any.
yeah, well, who has the responsibility for data minimization, or who has the responsibility for data management even, if we're talking about mobile, let's say, many players in the ecosystem. The app developer is in a pivotal position, but the platform provider, the ad people, there's even the carriers also have a role to play, and the most desirable outcome from the perspective of the user, as I apparently am in this ecosystem, it would be for them to cooperate and make it easier for me to have some control. So without intending to name any particular platform, a more vertically integrated system can allow for controls in an easier way, can make it easier for a consumer to understand what's going on and make some decisions at a global system level rather than app by app by app. I mean, that would work a lot better for people, and I think a sort of perspective that I would like to see more of in that ecosystem, and which is just a piece of the Internet of Things. The whole thing is all complicated like that. Is the Soylent Green principle that data are people, that this isn't bits and bytes to be monetized merely. It's actually pieces of me, and a recognition of that, would be very helpful in a mindset in developing the systems and the apps.
It's interesting, you look, and I guess, so a lot of people log into stuff using Facebook now or Twitter. And I wonder how many people go and say log in, and they use some product, or use some service, and then they don't go back, but they logged in. How many people go back into their Facebook privacy settings and look at the list of all the apps and sites that they've granted the access to information? And I knew, but I'm a nerd, is that, and then all of a sudden, like,
It's
wow,
not easy.
I haven't gone to that in ages, and I revoke, half of them. And a lot of them that I revoke are my company's products that I may have beta tested, but I don't use that. Is that I look, and whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or using other of those universal logins, where, I mean, Facebook, I'm granting this app, if I want to use it and log in Facebook, access to this information of mine. And then the second piece is, and I know that we struggle with this and we work with a vendor to find a solution, is when somebody revokes our permission, how do we know to delete and stop using that stuff too? And that takes work on our side, but I don't know how many people really go through the whole process and go look back, or that everything they've ever used Facebook to log into over the past 8 or 9 years still has access to all their
So
data.
I think one of the other interesting things to consider is just the shift in technology and the generational shift. And so there's been this misperception for years that young people are going to give away privacy, right? And it's actually grandma and grandpa are relentless on Facebook, right? They're using emojis now. The kids are gone. They're on Snapchat, they're ephemeral messaging, they're using WhatsApp and group messaging, where they form a group with 2 people to talk smack about the third person and then form another. So part of this is, in this first build out that we've had, there's been incentive to share. And I think that there's a shift in technology happening. There should be a way that you can engage and have the off switch on. And I'm not sure that the answer is having legislators or regulators dictate, but rather the market dictate. And that, there should be this, the table is set for people to care about privacy from a consumer products and services standpoint. It hasn't happened yet because there really haven't been breakout companies. But the opportunity is there, and you're seeing a shift from the bigger platforms to close in on themselves, right? Now that the financial incentives start to align with how can we deepen that engagement and how can we box out these third-party developers who we built our platform off of.
Anna, how does this all play out in this more recent experience you've had with health and fitness apps? Because it seems like the motivation for those is entirely different.
Well, it can be similar and it can be different, depending on the app. One of the questions that I continuously struggle with is that an app is not an app is not an app. There are some apps that are basically kind of fun play toy things. And I don't know that unless they do egregious things like, collect, the flashlight app that was collecting all kinds of data it shouldn't have been collecting, I don't know that those apps matter as much or can do as much damage as an app, for example, that's designed for medical uses. So there's a whole range of things that happens. But there are some also unexpected dynamics that are going on, particularly in healthcare. For example, many employers now have wellness programs. And if people wear wearable trackers like step counters or fitness trackers of other kinds, they get discounts on their health insurance. That has some very interesting consequences, not just because it allows these wellness platforms, as they call themselves, to collect and combine all kinds of lifestyle data, health data, potentially some purchasing data, in order to, quote unquote, help you live a better, healthier life. But it also leads more people to use these devices who otherwise wouldn't necessarily do so. Many people want to have reasonably affordable health insurance or more affordable health insurance, so they will wear a device which otherwise they wouldn't wear. So we have a whole spectrum of things in health. I think people are very curious about the area. They're very curious about how their bodies work. They're very curious about how they can improve themselves. And so there is an inherent motivation for people to use these apps, but there's also an external motivation to get more people to use them, in part so society can eventually benefit from more and better information about human health, but in part simply financial motivation on behalf of employers and insurers. And I think there are some significant issues there that can't be addressed by the market.
I think we have a little, oh, there's Joel. Do we have a little time for questions? How are we doing? Or do we have too much time? We're okay? Well, if there are any questions from the audience, we'd love to hear from you. If you have a question of a particular member of the panel, then please specify to whom you're addressing it. Any questions? Yes.
Can I ask a question? This is a ringer.
We're not going to be graded, are we?
Nah, grades were already due. So Edith Ramirez, in her remarks earlier this morning, said that that in her role, the FTC will be encouraging the app platforms to be pushing privacy to the developers community. How do you see that playing out? If you were in her shoes, what would you want the FTC to do?
The California Attorney General already took a step in that direction in 2012 when we had a series of meetings with Apple and Google and even RIM and Facebook and Microsoft and HP to talk about what greater role the platforms, the stores might play in encouraging privacy. And what we ultimately came to, and was agreed to and signed was that the stores would all put a field in their, whatever you call it, where you go submit your ad so that your app so it can be sold in the store. They would put a field for a link or the actual privacy policy to make it possible for a consumer, an individual, to see who is interested, what the policies are before downloading the app and having it suck all their data out. So they did that. Now, they did not, however, agree to require that, just merely to provide the field.
It's interesting, I think so with at least in iOS, if I don't put my own privacy policy, it ends up being Apple's default privacy policy? I
No,
think? No,
it's
nothing
just
is there?
blank. It doesn't even show.
Yeah, but I always find it interesting is that's how sometimes I figure out actually who the app developer is when I'm looking at things is, someone approaches us to do something with us and wondering, all right, who publishes the app? Is it them? And I look to see whose privacy policies are in there.
Yeah, it'll usually be a link to their website policy, which may or may not actually directly describe the app's practices. So
I think
some regulators, like the Attorney General's office, follows up with them in that case.
the real issue is an operational one, and it's super interesting because these platforms, they get really big by evangelizing third-party development, right? So if you're Facebook, you're Twitter, you're like, come on, build your company, Salesforce, build on us. And then when you're Twitter and Meerkat explodes, then you immediately cut off their access to letting people sign in using Twitter, and you buy up a competitor, Periscope. And so one of the things from a governance standpoint is third-party development is like, hey, we're going to make these APIs and SDKs available and then use them as you want. And then, by the way, we reserve the right potentially to be arbitrary and capricious about shutting you down later. But the way that they make these development platforms available, they give wide latitude to the third-party providers. They actually want them to go out there and build and make this platform more robust. But then when it's no longer in their own financial interest, not because of privacy, but because of competitive interests, then they restrict the use. And so I think there could be greater control on what data is made available to those third-party developers. Right now, it's all or nothing. You get the API access or you don't.
Well, that actually raises a question about the relationship between data minimization and innovation, or data minimization and the amount of development that's going to go on. Because I think there is an inherent tension. On the one hand, the FTC is telling people minimize data, and on the other hand, every time that statement is made, there's somebody who stands up and says, but if we don't collect the data, we won't innovate, we won't know that there are these correlations that we didn't know about before, and it wouldn't have occurred to us to do whatever it is without the data. So I think the platforms sort of try to have it both ways. On the one hand, they want as much data available to the developers as they can give them, so the developers will do more things. And on the other hand, there is their own reputation. Apple has been standing up and saying, we're not in the data business, we're in the device business, and so we're more privacy protective than the other platform. But I think we really need to talk about data minimization being viable in an environment where we're trying to push innovation and really new kinds of things.
Yeah, it has a negative effect, not just on innovation, but also, I think, competition. And I don't hear a lot of people questioning that. I mean, for us to compete, or for ad targeting networks to compete with the Googles and now Verizons of the world, we need access to user information. And if we can't get access to user information, if we're forced to minimize, then the Googles and the Verizons will have all the information, and we won't be able to compete with them. And then we'll be looking at a competitive landscape that looks more like a monopolistic economy than anything else, I think, which is pretty frightening when you're talking about user information.
Yes, here?
You all have multiple roles in this data privacy business. Thank you. And I'm a data privacy lawyer as well as a user, of course, of many of these apps and other things. I appreciate Joanne's statement about the privacy policy as a governance tool. As someone who's drafted privacy policies, I think they're much more useful in that way than they are in giving consumer notice. But unfortunately, I think the focus has been, perhaps even from your office, on giving consumers disclosure. I think as a result of the unreadable, lengthy nature of privacy policies and the widely known fact that nobody reads them, their importance has been really, really discounted. I think if you played up the use for the companies of the governance purpose. So that's my statement as a privacy lawyer, but as a user, last night I had to deal with McAfee antivirus on my phone. And the McAfee tool was telling me that I should get rid of, that there were that some of the apps on my phone ask for too much information. And I tried to get rid of those apps, and the phone wouldn't allow me to uninstall them because they came installed on my phone. And actually, the one that was recommended, one of them was the NFL mobile app, which I never use, will never use, and I'd like to uninstall it if it's collecting data, unbeknownst to me. The other one is the very Verizon, something like Verizon Navigator. I think it has to do with location, but it's Verizon who put it on the phone, and McAfee is telling me that it takes too much information. So somewhere between those lengthy privacy policies that nobody reads and the tiny little things on the mobile screen, because I look to see, I do read those things about what the apps collect. And there isn't any explanation of why something that doesn't seem to need video is asking for it. And I think if I have little patience for this, consumers who aren't data privacy lawyers have even less. So I know that I'm sorry for being so lengthy. I know there have been, with regard to the privacy policy, there was a move at one point to use icons as a quick way of alerting consumers to what an app or a website or other device will collect. And my understanding is that's been abandoned. I'm interested. I know that it seems like most of the privacy policies use the layered approach, where they give you a simple couple of lines, and then if you want to dig deeper, you can click on it and do so. But even that still has the lengthy privacy policy.
Is there a question?
Yeah, the question is, what are the approaches that can be used with regard to privacy policies to make them more about governance and to really be more useful to consumers?
I just wanted to jump in and say one of the very important uses of it is that it's been the anchor of enforcement actions by the agencies, and it's been the subject of class actions. So not just the internal governance of saying, I'm gonna go through and get my house in order and see that it matches up. When a federal or state regulator or agency wants to go after somebody, or there's a class action, they're saying your description doesn't match your practices. And so it's very important from that standpoint. It's very hard to distill it down, even if people wanted to. These are complicated things. It'd be very hard to distill it down to icons, and then how would you have that, the enforcement mechanism, how would you have essentially the contract between the user and the individual if you didn't have it?
I think the approach that both the FTC and the California Attorney General and others, including the NTIA, has taken is to the idea that you should supplement the comprehensive policy statement with a short form notice that highlights the potentially surprising or problematic practices. That is something that is easy to read, that says, you know, I'm NFL, I'm taking your location every 10 minutes or whatever. And ideally, that gives you a choice about that, but at least highlights the things that are out of line with the basic functionality or that, and that involved sensitive information like financial, health related, et cetera. And if that is the form that came out of the NTIA that kind of highlights some of those. It's what we recommend in our Privacy on the Go. It's what the FTC and its mobile guidance recommends, and it's been out there a lot. But as a supplement, so it's notice as opposed to the policy statement, which is more comprehensive.
I think this is one of those moments when, ironically, the app industry is way ahead of all other industries. And I mean that quite honestly. The scrutiny that app developers have rightfully drawn about their data collection has created a response from our industry, which I think is far ahead of what you would see in a bricks and mortar store. You don't walk into your shopping store, your mall, and get literally disclosures about the collection of tracking information, the information that's being gathered at your point of sale. They don't give you the opportunity traditionally. Facial recognition. And Apple is going to say, here it is. Here's what we're doing. And that we've been forced to do that. I think that's probably the right response. But ironically, we focus so much on apps because I think they're new and novel and still sort of clever. And we've forgotten that sort of old guard industries haven't done nearly as much. I wish that everyone would come up to what the app industry is already doing. We would all be better off as consumers, I think.
And there are still some effective use, there is some effective use of icons. The challenge with icons, I think, is getting universal agreement on which icons mean what. So there have been several little sets of them proposed. Some of them seem to take hold, like, the you are Wi-Fi connected, those little wave things. That seems to be pretty standard at this point, and the way that location information is indicated with some kind of little wedge or arrowy thing, that seems to be somewhat standardized, but
I mean, if anybody uses Facebook on the new iOS, you'll see that when you switch off of Facebook to another page, Apple tells you at the top, Facebook is using your location. And so there are competitive forces at work here. And the nature of these platforms, they're sort of like governments in themselves. They have their own set of rules. And I think there is actually a very positive storyline that incentives should line up for people to treat privacy as a competitive advantage.
And I know at a couple of our at one of our app developer workshops that we did, we had some venture capitalists who talked about the data practice vetting that more of them are doing now before they invest, that they don't want some big blow up that imperils their investment. So that is another indication, I think, that to some extent the market is kind of moving in that way, in spite of the fact that, our information is the fuel, I say, that largely fuels advertising, but.
Over here, yes, sir? I guess there are two people, so I'm not sure whose hand was up first, but we'll start right here and then move over there.
Florian Schaub from Carnegie Mellon University. You talked about, some of you mentioned this issue that there's a lack of explanation going on. And I think what Andy just mentioned with the platforms having power, that also starting to play out in terms of apps giving more explanations. And Tim mentioned this aspect of, app developers should really treat their consumers as partners and build trust this way. So on iOS, when an app wants to access your location, your contact information, any type of information, you get this little pop-up message, and you have to accept it or you have to reject it. So there's a direct control in your flow of activity, something that's lacking from privacy policies. Privacy policies are useless to users. They're great as government tools, but they have no use to inform or help users make decisions. It's just
if there's a decision to make, you see, because it's binary there. They need you're not going to get that pop-up notification unless if you change the default or if you didn't switch.
But it's the same on a website that collects my information and location information. If the browser would pop up a similar message, all of a sudden I would have to make this decision. And yes, it's a binary decision, and it's probably not enough. but it shows that
No,
that
but it's
people.
way more than a no decision, which is what most of the issues in the privacy policy really give you.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah,
But what's
I
interesting,
think you're-
what's interesting around this, I just want to add this, apps started building screens, explanation screens around these pop-up notifications. So you don't click no. They actually explain why they access your contacts, why they access your location. And I think that's great, because that shows the power of these platforms. If the platforms focus more on these just-in-time notifications, you can actually nudge the companies to also provide explanations why they're doing stuff. If those explanations are always benign and accurate, well, that's probably a different story. But I think it's an interesting way of thinking about this.
But there are different kinds of notices for different times, right? So you need to have some understanding of what you're about to download before you download it. So there is some information that you want to have to even determine if you want to have an app on your device. And then there is the notices of these unexpected things that happen that say, oh, the app is now accessing your location, and you're wondering why, because you didn't think you were doing anything that required that. So I don't think we should be conflating the two. I think there is a need to somehow translate privacy policy or something that explains to the consumer what the app does so they have an intelligent choice to make about downloading or not, unless the thing comes pre-installed and there's nothing you can do about it. And then there is a continuous set of choices that they might need to make as they use the app or the device.
Can I ask a question? Who should make those decisions about how disclosure should look? Should that be the FTC? And what about global apps? I have one of our app makers is in Belarus. Should they be under Belarusian jurisdiction, or should they be subject to all EU jurisdiction, which is expensive? Who should be making these decisions?
In designing the app, knowing that you're going to different jurisdictions for user appeal, who makes those decisions?
I think all apps are global now, frankly.
So they don't have to make any special dispensation?
You can access the Chrome store anywhere.
I've been up in my soapbox a long time about this. I think the great privacy question of the next decade will be, how do we actually deal with UI and UX, user interface and user experience, right? This is really the great question we have to wrestle with. Are we actually conveying information to people in a way that they can understand, they can respond to? Are we giving them what they want? And really, I think design is an art and not a science, and it's in its infancy as even an art form. And if we can learn more about how to communicate to a mass audience with different language skills, with different intellectual capabilities, with different experiences, with different age groupings, all at the same time to mass produce an app, we will substantially advance consumer understanding, substantially increase the ties between a company through its app and the consumer, and I think we will have a better meeting of the minds between the consumer and the business. If we can do that, we really will have obviated a whole series of really tough privacy questions, but we are nowhere near, in my opinion, getting that right. And that's true, again, not just in the app world, but in every store. I mean, if you walk into a store, again, there is no place where they are going to literally say, all right, you're about to shop for a new tie. Here are all the privacy things that we need you to understand about what's happening with you as you walk in the store physically.
I mean, Tim, that's true, but the data that they get, even if they're using facial recognition to determine is it a man or a woman that's coming down the aisle, which many people do, the data they're getting is maybe 4 rows of data as opposed to what you might get through an app. So it's a fair point, but it's they're really different.
Yeah, I think you're asking too much from both the companies and, frankly, the regulators. I mean, if you look at the auto industry, maybe similar, maybe not. What really made a difference in drivers understanding the safety risk with cars wasn't the regulators and it wasn't the companies.
Well, what is in fact being done in that respect now? I mean, how are we moving in that direction, and what are the steps that we're seeing?
There's lots of research going on at places like Carnegie Mellon, and for all I know, Fordham, I don't want to slide it, on user interface and how to how people understand what's being presented to them in the mobile space, in the online world in general. And I think your point about the brick and mortar data collection being less robust and problematic from a privacy perspective is accurate, but that's becoming less true since the most major brick and mortar businesses also have an online presence, and therefore they have a mobile presence, therefore they can marry data, and even though they're not getting, you know, I'm paying with my credit card, and now they got me, right there in the store, and they can pull the other data together, so.
But the answer is that you should probably be able to pay without disclosing
Yes.
who you are.
Yes.
The answer is
Yes.
innovation and technology. These are super tricky areas if you try to legislate them.
The gentleman over here, yes.
Thanks. I'm Ted Weitz. I'm an attorney and also an adjunct professor here at Fordham. Most of the discussion that's taken place at this point has talked about things like the user interface and the consumer consent. And as we look increasingly at the Internet of Things, people who download an app generally understand they've downloaded an app, and there's some implication of that. People who access a website generally have some understanding that they're accessing a website. People who buy a refrigerator generally have no understanding that they're buying something, and they also have no user interface to the refrigerator to talk about what it's doing. And beyond the refrigerator and the relatively simple elements of that, or the smart thermostat, or the children's monitor that actually can, let your neighbors watch your children in their crib. If you look at what's happened with automobiles and the onboard devices on automobiles, they've been there actually for years. They haven't been necessarily sharing information, but most people who buy a Chevy don't understand that they're buying an app that is transmitting an enormous amount of information, or at least storing a lot of information that's accessed every time they get their car inspected or go to a gas station. So I'd be interested in the panelists' comments on how all the things we're talking about for this generation apply as the Internet of Things applies more broadly.
I think it's even worse. Not only the appliances and devices in our home, our cars, whatever, but the streets, the sidewalks, from the red light cameras to lights that are observing you. I mean, there are places where we have no choice, let alone knowledge, but no choice. You're being recorded in some way. I know somebody who's active in the security field who always wears a large brimmed hat and great big glasses when she goes out in public where there might be video, because that's everywhere. So the FTC and their Internet of Things publications that came out recently make some, and Chairman Ramirez mentioned some of them, make some kind of intriguing suggestions about ways to provide some notice and choice in the Internet of Things, not on the device, but in other ways that I thought were intriguing. I don't know if the implementers think they are intriguing.
So I think there's an opportunity for people to develop technology which gives you a zone of privacy that proactively takes on that other technology, that takes on that surveillance. And it's going to be very hard to work legalese into some of the forms that distributed, decentralized technology is going to come in. But there's a huge, massive consumer-facing opportunity for privacy protective technology.
Well, I would ask, though, how that massive opportunity is going to play with law enforcement and other interests, because one of the reasons France has a law that doesn't allow women to cover their face in public is theoretically security. So now I can put on a burqa and all the cameras are completely useless for figuring out who I am. I just walk around in a burqa. That's very old-fashioned technology that gives me a zone of privacy from a whole bunch of surveillance technologies. But the fact is that somebody can pass a law that says, no, these are public spaces. We need to have people visible in public spaces. Therefore, any technology that provides a quote-unquote zone of privacy is illegal and unacceptable.
So I think this is my area, so I can get charged up. I'll try to stay settled down a little bit. But I don't think that you can have anonymity. And I work a lot in payments, and I have worked with the Bitcoin Foundation for a couple of years, and big proponent of decentralized tech and what's coming. I don't think you can have anonymity. Secret had a lot of problems. When you have anonymous interactions through technology, you can have bullying, you can have a lot of bad things, but pseudonymity is the answer. And so, or it's been called differential privacy. There are different names for it. I think that is where the innovation is going to come from. You cannot have complete anonymity and have it jive with Homeland Security, right? That's just something, or AML, KYC and payments and things like that. But you can have pseudonymity where people can still engage in a connected world, but do so without disclosing their personal information.
Shameless plug, I had a piece in Forbes about this last month. And I think what's important is to distinguish between sort of the monolithic idea that the Internet of Things is one thing. I broke it into at least 4. Most of the sensors out there are actually going to be not on consumer-facing devices. They're going to be on factory equipment, on farming equipment. They're not going to collect any bit of personally identifiable information. We can have a different rule set for the data that's collected by those than one that would, in fact, collect personally identifiable information. And then I think some of the question, and I don't have the answers here, I wouldn't presume to say that I do, is there's something different about a first-party relationship, I think, as a consumer, versus a third-party relationship. So in the future, we may know that our refrigerators are going to collect more of this information, but we put that refrigerator in our home and we want the, I don't know, Kenmore or Viking, whatever your preferred appliance is, we will have some choice over that, and we will at least have some relationship with that. It's very different when we're talking about the third-party sensors that are going to be passively collecting outside of our home, outside of our car, on street corners, in our offices. I think that's an area that needs a lot of work.
And there are already some California laws regarding, of course, regarding smart grid and some other IoT concepts. So, for example, a few years ago, about 2010, I think, the legislature passed a law that limited the gas and electric utilities from sharing the household level usage data with third parties without express prior consent. Then that was further amended a couple of years later, maybe last year, maybe 2013, to put obligations on the third parties who might be getting this data on what they could do with it and what kind of disclosures they had to make about it, but some actual use and sharing limitations. So I mean, I don't think a law is the answer to every privacy problem, but I think it can be an answer.
Guidelines, Joanne, guidelines.
Yes, well, those were laws. Those are actual laws passed by the legislature, not by the Attorney General. It's tricky to regulate for a number of reasons. One of them being that if you're kind of ahead of, the dead bodies, the really obvious harms, you're resisted because show me the bodies. If you wait for the bodies, you've also got you get hysterical headline-driven legislation, which isn't always the best. You also get very entrenched, and somewhere just before that, business models that will fight it bitterly. So that's how sometimes getting ahead is the way it goes, and that may or may not be the right rule. I think it would be better for the business community to engage a little more in the more reasonable regulation rather than resisting everything as the end of innovation, the internet, and life as we know it.
Any other questions? I just have one I want to wind up with, because this means a lot to lawyers, redress, and you mentioned redress. What did you have in mind would be potential, because this is essentially, I guess, an industry method of redress rather than one that is legislated. What did you have in mind for redress when you mentioned that?
I really am anticipating, and I hope it will get there, a fulsome set of opportunities for an individual to go to a business, either a first party or third party, and say, you made a mistake with my data and it has caused me the following consequences. Now, we're a long ways away from figuring out how to do this, but we should be thinking about this as businesses, I think, because we're asking consumers to trust us. We're asking them to give us data, and we're asking to be able to innovate using their data. I think, putting on my consumer hat, I want a business to say, when we have made a mistake, or a mistake has been made because of either an error in our data, because you used data from one context that is totally inappropriate in another, that we should have to do something to make up for our mistake. It will not be, this is going to take a long time to get there, but I think it's an important thing to do. There's got to be some sort of rebalancing in my mind of the consumer business bargain to make the marketplace function more effectively. And I think, frankly, if we're going to ask for more data from consumers, we should ask more of our businesses as well.
Do you have a thought on process?
Well, this is your realm, and I'm a recovering lawyer, and I think those things need to be fleshed out. You should be able to call up a business pretty regularly and be able to say, look, you're applying this data inaccurately, or that's not me. There's another, Susan Smith here that whose data you're using. I think that's basic stuff, and we should demand it as consumers.
Well, it sounds good, but for any of us to give redress, we would have to have some laws on the books that would allow for that to occur. And with that, I think we don't want to enact any more laws right now. We want to get on to break and the next panel, right? Thank you. But I want to thank our panel. You're terrific.
Thank you so much. Well, I'll take a 15-minute coffee break out this way.